Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Persuasion and Social Movements. We are heading into the midterm. It is almost spring break, but hopefully that doesn't mean much to you because your readings so far, I feel, have been fairly light. In case you didn't notice, this week we jump from about 2 chapters ahead to chapter 9, where we're going to talk about narrative and the narrative paradigm, specifically how they work in social movements. I did this for a very specific reason, so just follow along. It will all work in the end. So when we talk about the narrative paradigm, what are we talking about? And when we talk about the use of narratives, does that just mean telling stories in the public sphere, or does it mean something more than that? So today we're going to take a pretty broad view of just what the narrative paradigm is before we dive into the stuff that's in your book. So let's begin with what the narrative paradigm is not. A lot of people ask me, why do they have a narrative paradigm? What's the opposite of that? And the answer is the rational world paradigm. Now, that doesn't mean that the narrative paradigm is irrational, but follow me for a second. The rational world paradigm is based on the assumption that we can come to know the world deductively and empirically. So by using our senses and by deducing from those senses the things that we see in the world, the things that we hypothesize about, and that we can follow sort of the scientific method or deductive logic method in order to come to conclusion, that is the logical paradigm. And it's referred to as the logical paradigm because that's the way that reasoning and logic has always been defined, sort of by by empiricism and by deductive logic. So it's not a critique to say that the narrative paradigm it's not to say it's not logical. It just means that it's different from the usual, sort of, to be honest with you, patriarchal and hierarchical structure that has always been used to sort of explain phenomena in the world, okay? So especially when it comes to discourse, how we measure discourse in the rational world paradigm is a very difficult question to answer. A lot of the persuasion theories that I'm sure you've encountered over your time in studying communication would suggest that there are empirical ways to study persuasion. And that's not necessarily untrue. It's just that there may be an alternative way to study how persuasion works. And that alternative is not necessarily the direct opposite of the logical paradigm, but it relies on different assumptions than the logical paradigm does. And what it relies on is storytelling. Now, where do we get this idea of storytelling that it's so different from the logical world paradigm? Well, here's the thing. Humans have been telling stories since humans have been around, okay? That is how knowledge was passed down in the oral tradition. It's how we've learned certain little colloquialisms like chicken noodle soup is good for when you have a cold, which we have also scientifically proven to be true for a number of reasons, that it makes you feel better. Not that it's a cure, but it makes you feel better, right? And some of these other sort of what we call old wives' tales or common sense or just sort of things that we know based on our culture, the way we were raised, and the stories that were handed down in our culture from time in perpetuity, to be honest with you. And so narratives are actually the first way that we learned, the first way that we came to share experiences. It was when we started trying to find a more systematic way of knowing the world, of being able to categorize and unify meaning in the world, that we come to the logical paradigm. And so for a long time, the narrative paradigm was sort of discounted as evidence. The narrative was not considered to be evidence or to be substantial enough to help us understand a reasoned response or a rational argument, or even that it could help us get to the truth. And so what we end up with in this paradigm is sense making, trying to put together the different pieces of the world and how they make sense, usually in a story format, in a narrative format, how those make sense so that we can share the experience. Now, I tried to come up with a few examples of that specifically for you, and I'll be honest with you, I didn't come up with many. It's something that basically, if you want to come to understand something, we do this thing called crowdsourcing sometimes, right? Where, which is basically an economic theory, but we use it sometimes for knowledge. For example, I'm in a lot of Facebook groups where people talk about having particular autoimmune diseases. Diabetes is definitely one of them. And one of the things we talk about are complications from our diseases, and especially when we combine them with certain foods or certain activity or with certain medications and so on. We share these experiences so that we can learn from each other. So I had a friend today who posted, "Hey guys, whenever I do A, B happens." And that B part is an effect of one of the diseases that we all share. And I looked at the comments on this, and there were as many comments of people saying, well, when I do that, I have no problem. Or I've done that in the past and had major problems, so I stopped doing that. We all have these different stories, these different experiences with narratives tied to them that we're then able to share with her so that she can sort of come to her own conclusion based on all of these individual experiences. In other words, the narrative paradigm is incredibly inductive. It's a way of looking at learning not through the deductive empirical experience, but through the inductive narrative experience. People tell us stories. That's sometimes experience we don't have, or we never will, or we're going to have that experience and we need somebody else to share their experience. Is it big T truth? Is it been proven scientifically? No, but it's been given to us as an experience to help us with our knowledge. If you've ever had someone who's about to go have a scary experience, say, for example, a particular procedure, I'll go with a popular one, a root canal, okay? I've had 5 in my life, so I know what's coming. My mom has had like 8, and my siblings, none of them have had it ever. My husband's never had a cavity. So trying to explain to them what the experience is like is one of the ways for them to reduce uncertainty about what's coming. Now, you can't alleviate everybody's fears or questions necessarily, but you can answer them from your own perspective. That's what that narrative is. And so they collect these different narratives of people who had good or bad experiences and what to avoid and what to look for and what to expect, really. And we give advice, right, through a narrative perspective. Okay, so I think that's enough on that. You probably gathered what the narrative paradigm really is. It's a way of thinking about the world that is different from the logical paradigm that we've traditionally used when it comes to knowledge making, okay, or knowledge sharing or persuasion even. But we do know that narratives can be very persuasive. They can create a sense of identification between you and your audience. They can create something called shared experience with your audience, which fits very closely with identification. There's really a couple of theories that are born out of the narrative paradigm. Your book talks about symbolic convergence. Now, One of the problems I have with symbolic convergence in this context is that that is really for small groups. So I'm not really sure what it's doing in a social movements book. Maybe you meet in small groups and then it goes to the larger group. But more often than not, when you're talking about a social movement, you're talking about a grand narrative and shared symbols on that very big level. So that's not to say that symbolic convergence is not a good one. It's just a little different for me. I'm more likely to buy into Burke, Burke, Burkean analysis that deals with looking at the world from a position of dramatism, that we all do things based on a motive, that we can figure out what that motive is if we look at the symbols that people use. That is to say, the language that people use. And the theory of identification comes from Burke as well. That idea of, I can get you to understand my position, then I am going to I'm able to persuade you. So you might join my organization if I convince you that there's a good reason to join it. If I'm going to put this into the experience of my my social movement, which I told you I would use as the example, and hopefully this is carried through for you and has been helpful in being consistent with helping you understand some of these theories and ideas, I'm going to go ahead and do it. One of the things that U-Turn in Education has done is it fights for public education, and just on the general, okay? So we're constantly defending public education from movements towards movements away from public education. For example, if you want to homeschool, great, go ahead and homeschool. That doesn't take anything away from public education unless you try to make a person's homeschooling curriculum into public education. That is happening right now. There is a state representative from Springfield who is attempting to get that very legislation passed because he runs a company that builds homeschool curriculum. And so if you could get that adopted into the public schools or require it, obviously that's, a billion-dollar industry. There are movements towards magnet schools, or what do they call those schools? It's not magnet, charter schools, which are somewhere between public and private schools. And that movement pulls away resources from your public schools. So having a number of charter schools in one area can be truly problematic for a school district. It can actually systematically destroy it. So you have to be careful with that. And again, that's nothing against an individual charter school. There's some very good ones out there. But on the whole, as a general rule, it probably should be avoided if you want to preserve your public school system. Private schools, again, you want to send your kids to private schools? By all means, send them to private schools. My parents did, God love them. I am not a fan. My brother sent all 5 of his kids to private schools. I think it's ludicrous to spend that much money. And by the way, I'm critiquing myself here because I went to a Catholic university as well. But why would we spend all this money when they can get a good education that's going to help them be successful in life at the public school? But if you want to do that, people should choose to do that. But it should not take away from the public education provided to everybody for free. So did my parents pay a ridiculous amount of money in taxes because we lived in one of the best school districts in that part of the state? Yes. Did they still pay for our tuition to go to, the private school? Yes. They paid for both, and they were totally okay with that. And I mean, if you want to be okay with that, be okay with that. Send your kids to private schools. But our argument is always the same. Whatever it is that you want to do with your child should not take away what is being done for other children in the community. Okay? So that's sort of a baseline for us. And of course, we do other programs. And another thing that we're constantly trying to do is protect intellectual freedom and First Amendment, right? Freedom of expression. Last year, U-Turn in Education was awarded the the Intellectual Freedom Award from the Missouri Association of School Librarians, which we were very proud of. We got that award because we were doing everything we could to protect school librarians, not just the books, but the librarians. And at first people were like, why are you trying to protect librarians? Of course, librarians are educators. They fall into the same category as teachers. May or may not be true, did not stop our librarian from being called on the carpet. And literally in June of 22, at a public meeting with the school board, people asked for her resignation and wanted her put on the sex offender list because she was lending out books that were in our library. Now you might think, wow, that's crazy. That's Nixa. That's extreme. Well, there's another guy in our state legislature. His name is Jamie Gregg, and he just proposed, and this got national attention, by the way, a new bill that would require that any teacher, any educator who was helping students with social transitions in whatever way that looks, if it's a social transition, I don't know, if you think you're gay and you become straight, does that count as a transition? I don't know. I think that it's a lot more transphobic than that, but and it's very vague. Just says any teacher who helps a student socially transition, and I'm sure it's specific to gender, including providing them with books or information, should be put on the sex offender list. Okay, this has gone way too far. So what the social movement saw as a singular problem in one place, we attempted to curb and curtail because we saw this coming. And even though the narrative was told in the New Yorker, which is a national magazine, news magazine, even though we got national recognition from the Washington Post, for our students did, even though we've worked with multiple universities across the country in trying to battle these types of, honestly, draconian laws and proposals, even though that's the case, it built. And now it is a proposed law in our state legislature. So we see here how one experience can actually extend and get bigger to a point that it becomes social policy. And that is why social movements are still important. I was talking with a couple of people about whether or not social movements are even relevant anymore. And for a little while there, I didn't feel like they were. And so I went back and I was watching, they started to become more relevant to me just prior to the pandemic. The pandemic actually really helped because we had anti-vax movements, we had pro-vax movements, we had mask movements, we had different movements like that, but we were also seeing some international movements come back to life. And then, of course, just prior to the pandemic, people were already talking about an anti-abortion Supreme Court case that was coming up through the ranks. And I mean, it was a slow walk, of course, but it always is, but it got there, as you all know. So we saw this building, and so I went back and I looked at the research on this, and I was taking a walk down memory lane. Back when Walter Fisher first proposed the idea of the narrative paradigm, it received some criticism, and that criticism came from a man I lovingly refer to as my academic grandfather. He was the guy who advised all three of the men that were my advisors in my undergraduate degree, my master's degree, and my PhD. I'm a little bit of what I like to call academically inbred. But Dr. Rowland, Robert Rowland, he wrote these pieces where he and Fisher basically debated each other putting out these publications one after the other that were answering and critiquing each other. And Robin really did make an argument that the logical paradigm is superior to the narrative paradigm. But what I also noticed was in all of the applications that they used, both of these incredibly good scholars, both of them used social movements, different social movements, as their explanation for why the narrative paradigm or the logical paradigm made more sense. And I loved that. That, of course, was back in the 90s, late 80s to early 90s. And I looked at the literature, and really between like 1995 and about 2010, 2012, there's very little on social movements. That may not sound like a lot of time to you, but it's like 20 years that no one was really writing much about social movements in communication scholarship journals. So I looked at that, and then in 2019, we started to pick up a lot of literature, a lot of scholarship again. And the reason is because of the pandemic. People started talking about how these were movements, the link between vaccines and autism, for example. And that was a fascinating one to me, and here's why. I've known about that debate for a long time, not because I have children. I've never born my own children. I've never had to make a decision about vaccines for my children. But my sister, who also doesn't have any children, works with a program in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, which is the city of Pittsburgh area. And she works for this program called, what is it called? Can't remember the name of it. It is a social work, county-driven. Basically, it's for child welfare. She's a social worker. She coordinates services for children who may have learning disabilities or mental struggles, mental illness. They're coming off of addiction. The courts are requiring that she go in and find services for them, or their parents call and say, hey, we need some help with this child in various different ways. Nothing is bad about the child. It's just that they need some extra support services. She only works with infants and toddlers. So, I mean, that's got to be a cute job, right? So she does child development work. And one of her friends, when they were very young, they were in college, got pregnant and had a little boy. And there was this huge debate. And my sister kept saying, don't get him vaccinated. Don't get him vaccinated. There's this work out there that's, I'm really dating myself and my sister here. There's this work out there that says that it's linked to autism. And lo and behold, her child was doing fine until about the age of 2. She gave him vaccines because she believed firmly in them. And lo and behold, about 3 or 4 years old, he was diagnosed with autism. Now, what's interesting about this is that several years later, my sister had to come back and say, okay, that study was completely debunked. It was a narrative. It was a story that came from a doctor who has since lost his license. You might have heard about all this. Who basically made a claim based on very, very little evidence. In other words, very few examples, that some children could end up with autism, and he linked it back to vaccinations. And it was untrue. It was linked to what they used to bind the, multiple vaccinations together. And it was disproven. It was disproven quickly. But the narrative was so strong that people just carried that for like 30 years. There were people, and there's still people, who claim that narrative is true. We have somebody running for president right now, RFK Jr., who is making that argument. So it's a very strong narrative. Narratives can be incredibly powerful. And that's what I want you to understand, is that when you create or participate in a social movement, the story that social movement tells will determine how successful or unsuccessful that movement is. I have been to multiple library board meetings now, and I keep saying I'm not going to say anything. I'm at the Christian County Library Board, where essentially you have a board that determines what services your library provides. And yes, this does include certain books that are put on the shelves. And I went to this library board meeting and I said, okay, I'm just going to sit there. I'm running for school board. I don't want to say anything. People tend to take me as incredibly elitist because, I think that all children should have access to all books. So clearly I'm a crazy liberal. And that's okay. I don't mind it. I like to think that I give them stories, and I like to think that I give them logic as well, because to me, the logical paradigm and the narrative paradigm are not antithetical to each other. And I would urge people to read Aristotle if they don't believe that to be true. So I went and I couldn't get in to the meeting at first because two of the board members and a bunch of other people were standing right in front of the doors, right in front of the entrance to the meeting room of the library. And they were in a prayer circle. Okay. Prayer circles aren't something I participate in, but they're not something that I'm going to interrupt either, right? Have respect for everybody. So I walked all the way to the other side of the building, went in, and that meant I was coming into the room from the opposite direction of the general public of where we're supposed to enter. And I ran into one of the library directors for the Nixa branch. I know her well. And I said, oh, hey, how's it going? I came in the wrong door. She's like, oh, you're fine. She said, are you speaking tonight? And I said, no, I just came to observe for once. And she said, well, we're not completely filled up. There's only 7 slots filled up. And I said, okay, well, all right. And then I thought for a second, what's she trying to tell me? And so I looked at her and I said, there's 7 for our side. And she goes, it's just like, oh my God, all of them were for cutting public funds, putting librarians on sex offender lists, all these advocates for these kinds of things. So I quickly ran to the back of the room where I couldn't get in. Time was getting short. I had 2 minutes to get my name in to speak. And I told her, I said, okay, I'll go last. Obviously you go in the order in which you turned in your sheet of paper. So I listened for 7 of these speeches, which each one can be a maximum of 3 minutes. So we're talking about like 20 minutes of these speeches of people telling horrifying stories about, I don't know if they were, 2 of them were personal narratives, right? And I have I believe everyone is kind of my thing. A couple of them were, I heard about someone who, that story has a little bit less credibility with me, but I do believe everyone. And all 7 stories were about being violated in some way. And then they would chastise the library board, and then they would pray for us. All of us, the rest of us, whoever we are. And I thought, oh my God, what do you do with that? How do you answer these, what would be, assuming they're true, heart-wrenching stories combined with just blaming the library board for this and then praying for all of us in a public institution where not everybody is going to agree with your prayer? So, again, respect everyone. I got up and said, I am not going to pray for you. I am not going to pray over you. I am not going to pray to you. And then I said, and I'm not going to tell you some story about being violated or someone else being violated that I know about. And I'm certainly not going to criticize you, the library board, for any of this, because I'm confused as to why whatever has just happened in the past 30 minutes has anything to do with you as a library board guiding us as the public in seeking out what we want from you as a library for our community. And ultimately, I ended up giving them a great deal of gratitude, even though I know there's 2 people on that board who completely disagree with me and really greatly dislike me, and that's okay. They still were politely listening. I thank them all for putting up with this discussion and listening to it, and for listening to me say none of that is relevant to the decisions that the library board has to make. And so look at what happened there for a second. I had to tell a story. And the story that I decided to tell was about not being able to come into the building and interrupting a prayer group, to demonstrate that we can have respect for each other's views without interrupting those views in a public place. In a place that's meant for public consumption, like a library board meeting. So I did tell that narrative. I was also very clear that I did not feel comfortable being prayed to, for, over, or whatever other, prepositional statement would follow that. And I said that most importantly, it was irrelevant, and here are the things that are relevant. And so at the end, I got to use everybody else's narratives. And I know that Tori 100% stopped me and asked me to speak. I mean, she didn't ask me to speak, but she asked me to speak, hinted that I should, for the purpose of making that narrative happen. So that when people go and tell the story, here's what happened at the library meeting last night, the narrative they have ends with what I said. And when I finished speaking, the president of the board said, and that concludes our meeting adjourned. And that was the end of it. So in a lot of ways, I had literally the last word. And luckily for me, that last word was thanking the board. So why do I tell you that story? Because that's the narrative that will now go out there, that shows the distinction between our movements. And if you're wondering, yes, I have been called every name in the book. Okay, every name. Do people believe that I need to be put on the sex offender list? I don't know. I'm a college professor, so that would protect me from minors. I'm not a librarian. But do I fight for these books that they claim are problematic to be put on the shelves in a library for adults and for teens? Yes, absolutely I do. And I 100% believe that every single book passes our Supreme Court's Miller test, which is the test to know whether something is considered obscene or not. And so it's important, I think, that we uphold those laws that help us uphold our public institutions, that keep things like public schools doing their job. Okay? And so that is the big reason why we call this a paradigm. Because you're not just looking at little stories individually, but you're looking at the entire narrative of the movement in order to understand what it's attempting to do. That doesn't mean there's not scientific scholarship and research that goes into understanding how books affect children. For example, if you've ever heard of the term bibliotherapy, that's a term I was introduced to just in the past 3 years. I didn't know what it was, but I had always been doing it all my life. That is to say, reading books for the purpose of understanding the world, for using it to get out my feelings of stress or anxiety or feelings of loneliness because I identify with a character and so on. Anyway, bibliotherapy is a thing. It's been studied scientifically. Scholarly research has been done on it, and that can be used to justify keeping all the books in the library as well. So there are a multitude of ways that narratives get used, and I don't get offended, but I don't have a great really reaction when people are like, well, I'm telling a story, so that should be persuasive. No, a narrative makes an argument. Okay? It makes a persuasive appeal. And so that's really the bigger difference between just a story that I'm telling you and a narrative that has an argument attached to it or builds into an argument. Now, you're probably going to ask the question, why did I take all that time to explain all that to you and not talk about the book at all? Well, because after the book gives you this brief introduction to the narrative paradigm, it then uses, I believe it's 3 examples, one from, I want to say like the 50s, one from the 70s, one from the 90s, and shows you these different narratives that were used for various movements, okay? So I think you can read those and you can handle it. And I would encourage you to, because my one example is not enough for you to really learn how this works. So I encourage you to read those 3 examples. I'm also going to put up for you on Blackboard right now, I'm going to put up links to a couple of articles that are from those original authors of narrative, and they're a little bit of their debate, and you can skim through those or read those however you like. I just think it would kind of support sort of what I've talked about tonight. And that's going to do it. All right, everybody, I will see you next week. Have a happy Monday.